And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. On this podcast, we're going to talk about monopoly in the long run. We're going to take a look at the long run monopoly graphs and the way that a monopolist will answer the three fundamental questions for any firm in the long run. And those three questions, we're going to answer those three questions down here below each time. And those three questions are going to be how much should the monopoly produce? What quantity of their goods should they produce? Number two, are they producing at a profit or a loss? And then number three, should they stay open and keep producing their good, or should they exit the market? And exit here is a long run concept, which means the firm will close down business and literally leave the industry forever. That's an exit from the industry, and we'll distinguish that with another concept when we talk about the monopolist in the short run on another video. So monopoly in the long run, let's just get right into this. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a monopoly graph. So here we have quantity on the horizontal, and notice this Q could be a lowercase q or a capital Q. Lowercase q means it's an individual firm. Capital Q means it's the entire market, and the monopolist is the individual firm and the entire market at the same time. And then we're measuring dollars on the vertical axis. And so let's draw some curves. So we're going to have the marginal cost curve for the monopolist, and that's going to look like this. And then we're going to have the average total cost curve for the monopolist. Remember, the average total cost curve should intersect marginal at its lowest point. And then since this is the long run, there are no fixed costs. So that means that the average total cost is the exact same thing as the average variable cost. They are the same thing since there are no fixed costs. So that's what's happening on the cost side. Then we need a demand curve for the monopolist. So the demand curve for their good is going to be downward sloping. That's going to be the demand curve. And then off of that, underneath that, is going to be the marginal revenue curve. So that's going to be the marginal revenue curve. So let's answer our three questions. So question number one is, how much of the good should the monopolist produce? The answer to that question is they produce where the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost. That's always the point of profit maximization. So the firm is going to produce at what I'll call Q1, where the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost, where the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost. That's always where the firm will produce. And so we're going to get what I call tunnel vision right here. We produce where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. Get tunnel vision. This is going to be our level of production. Draw a vertical line there. And here's my Q1. That's the level of production. Now, to answer our second two questions, question 2 and question 3, we have to label some other items. So we have to come up to the demand curve, because the firm, while it's going to produce based on marginal revenue, marginal cost, it's going to set its price off of the demand curve. That's one of the advantages to being a monopolist. So they're going to set their price up here, and the price is going to be the average revenue. So that's the price, or the average revenue for the firm is off the demand curve. Then we come from Q1 up to the average total cost curve, and that's where we're going to get the firm's average total cost and the firm's average variable cost. Because remember, average total cost and average variable cost in this case would be the exact same thing. Average total cost and average variable cost are the same thing because there are no fixed costs. And so the answer to question number 2 then is going to be, this firm is operating at an economic profit. They are operating at an economic profit. And how do I know that? I know that because the average revenue is greater than the average total cost. So the firm is operating at an economic profit because the average revenue is greater than the average total cost. And then question number 3, should the firm stay open or shut down? I'm sorry, not shut down. This is long run. So would they exit the industry? Shut down is a short run concept. We'll talk about that on another video. Should this firm stay open or exit the industry? And the answer in this case is they should stay open. And the question is why? Why should they stay open? They should stay open because their average revenue is greater than the average variable cost. The average revenue is greater than the average variable cost, and therefore this firm will stay open. So that's the first thing that could happen. is the first graph that could happen is the firm is producing an economic profit where the average revenue is greater than the average total cost. Now let's go to the second possible thing that could happen, graph number 2. So on graph number 2, again, we need to draw our marginal cost curve. It's downward sloping and then rises. That's marginal cost. And then our average total cost curve, which decreases, hits a minimum and then rises. Hits its minimum where it's equal to where it intersects marginal cost, and the average total cost is equal to the average variable cost. Now, that's the same as it was over here in this graph. But now what we're going to do is we're going to draw the demand curve down below. So here's going to be my demand curve, and below that's going to be the marginal revenue curve. So if the firm's cost curves and demand curve happen to look like they do in this graph, then how will we answer the 3 questions? Well, first of all, question number 1 is always the same. The answer to question number 1. The firm produces a Q1 where the marginal revenue, did I get that right? Yes, I did. There's my marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost. So that would be right here. The firm is we're going to get tunnel vision. Right here, the firm's going to produce at Q1. That's where the firm is going to produce. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's where the firm will produce at Q1. All right, now to answer questions 2 and 3, now we have to label the average revenue, which is on the demand curve. So if we produce a Q1, which we will, that's where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, then we come up from Q1 to where we hit the demand curve and come over. And that's going to be the average revenue or the price, same thing. It's going to be the average revenue or the price. And then we come from Q1 up to the average total cost curve, and that's going to be the firm's average total cost, which of course is also their average variable cost. Just squeeze that in here. It's also their average variable cost because average total equals average variable because there are no fixed costs. So this firm, we can say the answer to question number 2 is this firm is producing at an economic loss. And that means the reason why they're producing an economic loss is because the average total cost is greater than the average revenue. Or say that another way, the average revenue is less than the average total cost. So this firm is producing an economic loss. That means they are not beating their next best opportunity. They could be making more money if they produce something else. And their loss would be right in here. This would be their economic loss in between average total cost and average revenue. And so the answer then to question number 3 is if you're not beating your next best opportunity in the long run, then the firm will exit the industry. Why? The technical reason is because their average revenue is less than their average variable cost, because average variable cost and average total costs are equal in the long run. Okay, so they're going to exit the industry because their average revenue is less than their average variable cost. So let's go to graph number 3. The third possible thing that can happen, and this graph is a difficult graph to draw. So in the first graph, the demand curve was above the average total cost. In the second graph, the demand curve was below the average total cost. Now we're going to want the demand curve to be tangent to the average total cost. So very difficult to draw this graph. So here's my marginal cost curve. You'll excuse me if I mess this up. I don't have to redo it. Here's the average total cost curve, which declines, hits a minimum where it intersects marginal cost, as always. And remember that the average total cost and the average variable cost are the same thing. And now I'm going to kind of do this. I'm going to kind of do this backwards a little bit. So I'm going to want my demand curve to be downward sloping and exactly tangent to the average total cost curve. So that's going to be right there. The demand curve is tangent. And again, I'm going to do this backwards. So I'm going to bring down my Q1 because what I'm going to want to draw here is my Q1, my tunnel vision is going to be such that the demand curve is exactly tangent to the average total cost curve. And for that to happen, I need marginal revenue to intersect marginal cost at the point that makes that true, which would be right here. So that would be my marginal revenue curve. Now, so I kind of worked that in reverse when I drew it. Normally, you're going to have the marginal revenue, marginal cost curve like I did on the previous graphs, and then find Q1. That's technically what should be happening here. So let's see what we have. For this firm, they're going to produce, as they always will, they're going to produce at Q1. Why? Because Q1 is where the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost. There's my marginal revenue curve. There's my marginal cost curve. And right here is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So they're going to produce here at Q1. And that also happens to be where the demand curve is exactly tangent to the average total cost curve. Which means, the reason why this is important is because that means that at that exact point right here is where the average revenue is exactly equal to the average total cost. The average revenue is exactly equal to the average total cost, which, by the way, is also equal to the average variable cost, because average total and average variable are the same thing in the long run, okay, because there's no fixed cost. So let's answer our questions. Answer to question number 1. They're going to produce at Q1 where the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost. Answer to question number 2 is this firm has, I'm going to say it this way, I'm going to say they have an economic profit equal to 0. Why? Because the average revenue is exactly equal to the average total cost. The average revenue is exactly equal to the average total cost, and so economic profit is 0. And then finally, answer to question number 3 is I'm going to say, well, we probably just stay open. We're doing just as well as our next best opportunity. In fact, we're doing exactly equal to our next best opportunity. And so we're going to stay open because the average revenue is equal to, that's supposed to say equal to, let me back that up. Right here, that should be average revenue is equal to the average variable cost. So that means they're getting the exact amount of profits that they would if they produced any other good. They're doing just as well as whatever their next best opportunity is. Okay? And so since there's transaction costs to producing another good, they'll probably just stay producing this, whatever this good happens to be. Okay, so let's write out what our general rules are. What are the general rules or general conclusions that we came up with here? Our general rules, rule number 1, or the answer to question number 1, is we always produce a Q1 where the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost. That's always true. Answer to question number 2 is the firm is producing at an economic profit if the average revenue is greater than the average total cost, if the average revenue is greater than the average total cost. And that's what's happening on this first graph over here. Where is that profit? I didn't label it. I should have. Where is that profit? It's between average revenue and average total cost. So this is the firm's economic profit right there, that box right there, where the average revenue is greater than the average total cost. And then here on the second graph, now we have an economic loss. So an economic loss happens, a firm would be producing an economic loss if the average revenue is less than the average total cost. Then they're producing an economic loss. And finally, question number 3, should the firm stay open or should they exit the industry? Well, the answer would be they stay open if. They stay open if the average revenue is greater than or equal to the average variable cost. Then they stay open. That happens here and here. And finally, they will exit if what? If the average revenue is less than the average variable cost. That was on this second graph right here in the middle. They will exit if the average revenue is less than the average variable cost. All right, this has been Mr. Hagan talking about monopoly in the long run. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you on the next Econ podcast.